tonight I'm really excited. We have Mark Oberholzer and Daniel Ney presenting to us. Mark's an associate principal with KTGY. I know Mark from when he taught at Rice University, actually, and then Daniel Ney, he's a job captain over at Gonzalez Gooddale Architects and good friend of mine. And I admire the affordable housing work they've been doing, and I'm really excited to hear about some of the lessons they've learned through recently completed projects, and also hear about some of the challenges they've encountered, which sounds like, it's many in that arena. But beyond that, also thinking about how we might dislodge some of those sort of vestigial impediments. There's some rules that are certainly in place with good reason, but there are a few that maybe are not quite up to speed, and so thinking about that in the context of the shortage of housing that we have in California, I think really will set the stage. And Mark's going to present first, and then Daniel second, and we'll hold questions to the end. But as questions come to you, feel free to put them in the chat. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And we are not that big of a group, so let's just play it by ear. I mean, definitely we'll be watching the chat, but also maybe if a whole bunch of people show up, we don't do this, but maybe we just could be a little bit more like a salon than this sort of big forum format. Anyway, we'll play that by ear. And Jessica, probably if she was next to me, maybe she's kicking me under the table. I don't know, but we'll just wing it. Okay, so I'm KTGY in downtown. I'm gonna share my screen, and I promise this is the only like advertisement slide kind of, which is, but I thought it was a good place to start. We say this is our like company slogan, move the discourse of architecture forward by continuous searching for better. What you're looking at is looking down the canyon of a project that's under construction right now in Salt Lake City, 2 high-rises built with steel studs. So one of my interests is really alternative construction systems, and I wouldn't say steel stud is alternative, but it's less common. We entitled this jointly the same as it never was, recurring lessons of affordable housing, partly obviously as a riff on the Talking Heads song, but also because I think a lot of the themes are similar. In other words, the kind of context of affordable housing and what that means for designers and developers is the themes are the same, but it's constantly shifting the sort of specifics. And I think even in the last year, well, really 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, we've seen some shifts. So what I am doing is basically I'm going to show you 2 projects, really one in detail, which is a modular project. Well, they're both modular projects, one in a little bit of a cursory fashion, one in a more in-depth examination, but really under the I guess umbrella of these 3 aspects, which I thought were really important to talk about because they kind of knit a lot of the challenges, and I guess I'm supposed to say challenges and opportunities of affordable housing together: cost, time, and then accessibility may seem like a little bit of something from the left field, but it's actually, in my opinion, and probably anyone who's involved in affordable housing is like, yeah, that's a trending issue at the very top, especially during the pandemic. So speaking a little bit about costs, and again, I know I don't know the audience members that well, so some of you may be like totally old hands and even more experienced than I am in affordable housing, but I think that starting with cost, the driver for affordable housing is really that hardly anybody will do affordable housing unless there's an incentive. The incentives come from different places, but they're driven generally by tax credits or other tax revenue funding in lots and lots of complicated ways, which I am not qualified to talk about, but involve subsidies, involve master leases and tax credits primarily. So because it's public money, obviously there are requirements that go along with it. And typically those requirements have pluses and minuses. The plus is generally encourages better quality, higher level of sustainability, and to some extent, a desire for innovation to drive the market further and in a better direction than it is. But it does add cost, right? And it adds cost and requirements to it. And I think one of the, and not only that, but it's competitive, right? Most affordable housing is competitive. There are probably more funds available than ever before, but it's still competitive in the, whether it's a tax credit or some other program, they are competitive. So that means there's an impetus for higher quality, but that is going to drive cost. So, and again, you're not going to find me complaining about the cost. I mean, if you're in LA, you just know everything is expensive. And that's just the context we're in. But I mean, honestly, I get a little bit tired of hearing the cost per door is outrageous, for affordable housing. Yeah, it is, because it's complicated, right? And the requirements are different, and it's held to a higher standard. So, this isn't a policy debate, but it's really a talk about the context here. And that's really one of the things that and obviously the unspoken factor, no, I'm speaking it right now, the spoken factor of that drives a lot of cost is project labor, right? There's a project labor agreement, usually, often, or always, and that means workers that are building the building get paid more. That's a social good, but it costs more. That's makes it more challenging for the design and the development team. All of this is, if you're experienced, stating the obvious. If you're thinking about getting into affordable housing, good to know. But it is one thing that is starting to drive some serious talks about innovation and yield some interesting results. And that's really why I'm talking about these two modular projects. And you will not, what this isn't, this little presentation I'm doing, is not an ad for modular or KTGY. It's really just, hey, here we've tried this. We do a broad spectrum, I think, like most design firms, of if you do affordable housing, there's a broad spectrum of it. Some of it's modular, some of it's not modular, pluses and minuses. And I think that's what I'm hoping, without boring you, to share some of those things. So that's the cost, and really the cost. So we'll come back to the cost as we go through the project. Time is another thing, and I think that the time in affordable housing, obviously the construction time and cost of delivery, holding land, project delivery time, better said, is a great, it's tied to costs. It influences costs greatly. So faster projects is going to cost less to build, cost less to develop, and maybe more importantly, yield the housing faster, which is, I feel like I've been to almost every presentation for the last 5 years starts with, there's 60,000 homeless people in LA, and there's still 60,000 people 5 years later. It's totally discouraging. And to be fair and honest, this project that I'm going to show, this is a project in Westlake, Hope on Alvarado, that you're looking at the modules swinging there in the sky. But this project took a lot longer than anyone really had hoped, and that's the lessons learned coming. But the other time issue, besides all that, is really the funding time, which I think is not talked about as much, but it's super critical, and I think, Daniel, you'll probably have this experience, and other designers too. You pick up the phone, there's this deadline for a funding, and not only is there a deadline to get the funding, there's a deadline to use the funding. or the whole thing falls apart. And that's, that's sort of shockingly familiar, I think, if you're in this segment, but it's also for good reason, right? Because it is basically, approved, legislated, and through a political force or political will, I guess is the better way. And yeah, you need to spend it, not just sit on it. So but that impetus, which comes from the urgency, I think, that the whole region and city, county is feeling about the number of unhoused, puts a lot of pressure onto the process. So that's one other thing that pushes many teams to consider, call it construction innovation, call it modular, whatever. That's a pretty big deal. And that means different things for the way the project is structured and put together. Okay, and then then the last thing, and I'm sorry to laugh about this one, but it's like super significant, accessibility. And if thumbnail sketch, this is maybe, if you're easily bored, turn your ears off for 2 minutes while I talk about this. But basically, starting in 2012, really there was a number of lawsuits, or sorry, a number of plaintiffs filing suit against the city, because most of the city's booked on the books affordable housing was not accessible. It is very, very poor level of accessibility. Lawsuits happened, settlements happened. 2016, a similar lawsuit happened. 2019, a new settlement was reached, and it really has, in a way, made, the litigation, litigation has a point. It changes things. That's why there's litigation. It's the goal is good. The mess, from a designer's standpoint, the mess that we're left with in terms of complying is frightening, right? Literally frightening. Okay, but we'll come to that. But now let me just show you and talk through these 3 themes as we go through the projects, and hopefully that all makes sense. Okay, so this first project is Casa Paloma in Midway City. This is under construction now, and it is, it's American Family Housing is the client. It's 71 units, a typical, typical project size, for affordable housing, somewhere between, 50 and 100 is pretty typical. Not that they can't be less or more, but that's at least mostly what we do on that size scale. So it's a wood modular, and really I just have it, and you can see basically it's modular on grade, so there's no podium, right? And you're looking at, if you see my cursor, you're looking at the U-shaped building here, which is this outline here, right? And these are cruddy photographs, but they're from a construction cam, and they're the best that I could do. So there's that. But this is a couple weeks ago, so they're finished stacking the modules. They happened very quickly, coming back to time, I think it was a floor a week approximately. So it's 4 stories, 4 weeks to topping out. Topping out doesn't mean finished. In this case, there's the whole facade to come on, and all sorts of internal connections to make. But it touched on really, I think, the time particularly, and also the cost in the terms of project labor agreement. And if you're thinking the appeal to modular is getting away from the site-built project labor agreements, yeah, that's totally the strategy. I think the hope is that the jobs, and I think to a large extent what I have seen is that the jobs in the factory, they're not union, but they're higher quality jobs and better paid than site labor would be, than non-PLA site labor would be. So there's a kind of a little bit of a trade-off. It pulls it from anything off-site, pulled from the project labor agreement, but it's still, at least in my mind, and I don't think I'm just telling myself that. I've been to the factories. It's like, nah, it's better working conditions and it is better pay. Not union standard though. So that's the tension, I think, between, and that's what's fascinating to me about oh gosh, I just talk and talk and then I get through 3 slides. It's a fascinating thing to me about the tension between public goods, right? Um, cost of project labor versus cost of housing, right? They're related, they're both good. Okay, let me show you Hope on Alvarado. So this is a project that had a pretty ambitious goal. It's in Westlake, and basically a podium building on a slightly sloping site, permanent supportive housing. All of the supportive housing functions were in the podium, and then everything above, the repetitive, basically the housing units, happened. This is steel modular, not wood modular, and was the delivery method was design build because, and really it was a not a nonprofit. I mean, there was a how you say a technically there was a nonprofit involved, but really it was a for-profit developer. They said, we're going to do housing better, faster, cheaper, that kind of thing, and we're going to work with the manufacturer. And as it turned out, the manufacturer and the contractor ended up being the same entity, so it went design build. In this case, and the fly in the ointment was actually all 3 of those things: cost, time, and project requirements, right? So the problem with the cost was it was experimental. I mean, this was really the first building like this for this. I mean, I know there's other steel modular buildings in the world, plenty of them, but this was the first one kind of in LA of this scale that was manufactured overseas. These came from China. And there was this thing, can't remember what it is now, but I know, a pandemic that happened right in the middle of construction. And it's really, really hard to fly to China when it's not allowed. And it was a gigantic mess. So a lot of that mess resulted in time, which made a lot of cost issues, right? And tied the whole thing together. The good news, though, is and this is, basically call it a donut building around a central court with some roof decks. This is kind of looking down into the courtyard in a rendering form from the hovering above the roof decks. But like I said, everything above the podium is modular. And here it is being stacked. Now, at this moment, the modules were going in with a crane off of Alvarado at the rate of 1 floor per week. Again, and I think that's pretty typical. This is 87 units, permanent supportive housing, 1 floor a week, knocked it out. But then there really were a lot of issues with the building. Like I said, it was kind of an experiment, and we learned a lot of lessons on this. And most of the lessons were about modular. And just for instance, one well-learned lesson is, if you look at this, hopefully you see my cursor, like this is one module. It's a unit or half a unit, corridor, half a unit. This is just half a unit. It takes the same amount of time to place this half a unit as 2 half units. So, basically we had designed this really without thinking about how much more time we could have saved if it was primarily double at a corridor, right? That's a dumb example, but that's the kind of things you just go like, oh, it's sort of a head slapper. And then for the future projects, yeah, we've learned that. So here it is. You can see obviously downtown in the background from this drone shot. This is it finishing up. That's solar hot water, not photovoltaics. And then here's finally the finished, and people are living in it now. Another thing that we learned, we used PTAX in this version, and have realized that it really didn't save anything to do PTAX. It seemed like it'd be simpler. It's not. So we moved away from PTAX on the next 3 projects. And those 3 projects, same developer, different manufacturer. Now they're coming from, and let me skip ahead here, because I've got to wrap it up. Is this, we've got 3 projects under construction, similar program, different manufacturer. The manufacturer is Silver Creek from Paris, which is Southern California, across the mountains from the coast. And 3 design bid build projects. This is Broadway, Hope on Broadway, Hope on Avalon on the left, which is in the county, and this is Hope on Crenshaw, which is within the Crenshaw specific plan. So this one, if you're like a modular nut and want to see them, these modules are going to be lifted on the 29th of this month, November. So, if you happen to be passing by, you can see that if you have an interest in it. One quick word on accessibility, right? And I will keep it quick because it's super boring, and I think Daniel will have something more interesting to say. But this is a letter that we got, or an email that we got from the housing department, and basically saying, hey, you know what? We hear you. Their prior neutral accessibility consultant, NAC, that comes from litigation. That's what it is, right? So they couldn't do inspections. They hired ETA. They had a whole different approach to accessibility, and 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 I love this. There have been multiple non-compliant issues for which there is no current solution. No designer or developer or operator or owner or nonprofit wants to hear that, right? That's very, very complicated. And everyone knows it's a problem. Everyone likes to complain and point fingers, but we all collectively know it's an issue. And from HSID to DAS to the CASPs to the court-ordered neutral accessibility consultants, it's definitely a problem. I think everybody, if you've done any affordable housing, you're tripping up against this. And so that's something to keep in mind. And I wish I could say, and I've got a great solution for you. I really don't, but it should be on your mind. And I know that, just like a lot of difficult problems that exist for a reason, and there's more work to be done on that. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and I'd love to hear from Daniel. I think we decided to kind of wait and have like a sort of nice conversation with questions after Daniel presents.
Well, I mean, we can do that, or you have some time. I think we're only about 23 minutes in.
Oh, I thought I had
do you
just
want to
20
take a few
minutes.
comments, or 25, 30?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah,
I know
I
I had
think
a
we've got time for comments. I see, let's see, in the chat, Lindsay was asking, how did the modular units coming from China work with LIDVS?
Oh, yeah. So that really, except for it's a non-issue, basically. The way that the modular, basically the way in California, and some states are following and some aren't, but basically in California, the state Department of Housing Community Development, you basically submit to the city for site built and the state through the Department of Housing Community Development for the offsite work, right? Modular or whatever is offsite, right? And HCD, which is a State Department, has a list of 8 or 10 private company consultants who do that, who do the plan review and then also the inspection. So at this time, when this project was under construction, it was under fabrication, it really meant that, basically there were inspectors from the state certified third-party providers who are flying to China in the factory and doing inspections. And we flew out there too to look at the prototypes and make design changes and prototypes to the prototypes. So, but the problem is, again, when the pandemic happened, shipping got caught up. Tariffs happened too. That was tariff, and I think the tariffs are still in force. And interestingly, the tariffs raised the cost, but they didn't kill the project. But it was really more the coordination for inspection that was a problem, right? And the one tagging onto that, and this isn't really maybe what the question is, but I can't help but reflect, I guess, is that with anything built off-site, and this is where the frightening part of accessibility comes in. This project has four stories and there's 87 units, but something like 216 individual modules, like that's a module, that's a module, that's a module. Well, if you have an accessibility problem, in a factory, you know, you have it in every unit, right? Because they're all built the same exact way. It's a factory, right? And so you kind of need surety. And what we are doing right now, and you know, basically with accessibility inspectors, I mean, the ones that we've hired for the team, but then also sometimes we've been able to get agency inspections as well on an informal basis at the factory, as long as it's not in China. So they're coming to the Southern California factory and looking at things and having those discussions. So, and that's a little bit of where how disconnected maybe the manufacturing can be a problem. If it's more local, it's easier.
Makes me wonder if you could do a virtual mock-up review with a consultant and their inspector to help facilitate that.
Yeah, no, we hadn't thought about that. I wish you had been on the project team because yeah, maybe we could have.
So just to follow up on that, so you're basically saying you relied on your ADA consultants more so than any city regulator?
No, both, right? Because we've got this is where I start to get a headache when I try to explain it, because I don't fully understand it myself, right? We've got a CASP, right? We have to have a CASP. The plans go through, and even though the pieces are sealed by the state, the offsite, and the city on site, you know, the whole building, I mean, the city looks at the whole building, even though they can't make comments technically they can't make comments on the offsite parts. They still need to understand how the whole building is built and exits and things like that. But so you have our CASP making guarded comments. Remember, because of the litigation, everybody is like, this may not comply. And you're like, well, does it or doesn't it? And they're like, well, it may not comply, right? And so the department, you know, the DAS, I mean, I'm just saying like it is. Everyone knows this, right? The city will say, they have got their own criteria. And by the city, though, that's DAS, Department of Accessibility, right? And also HCID, right, for the housing. And they're different accessibility inspections, fine, but they make different conclusions. And the CASP, you know, these CASP inspectors, in a way, I sort of like admire them and pity them because they don't get paid that much, but they are on the hook for an incredible amount of liability. So, just because of the historical litigation, there's a lot of risk or perceived risk. So, you know, and there's a lot of unusually, let's call it unusually vague interpretations. Like, when is a U-shaped kitchen, you know, not a U-shaped kitchen? You know, we've run into that one, and it's like, it doesn't look like a U, but it's a U-shaped kitchen, or isn't it? You know, and it may be considered, you know, a U-shaped kitchen. It's like, well, you're reviewing it. Do you consider it or not? You know what I mean? Just tell me and we'll do it. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And you know what I'm talking about. And it's not devious. It's just a product of all of the, you know, all of the legitimate concerns and compromises and agencies and solutions, but it makes it super complicated. Even if you're not doing modular adds a little bit more to it and a little bit more risk, right? Because you're building in advance, way in advance. So you kind of need buy-in. And what I'm saying really is, in a practical sense, the manufacturer and the design team and the developer we've just sort of done a de facto, hey, figure out a way to get the local agency inspectors, the people that are going to look at it on site later, come and look at the prototype, right? And they're not, and so then, but you know, there's not that many manufacturers that are close enough to LA to do that, right? So that's a little bit of a challenge. So I think we have another project. Yeah, sorry, we have another project where it's actually not affordable housing. It's another experiment in market rate modular housing, but we're gonna ship, because it's from out of state, we're going to ship a prototype here. We kind of have to, right? Too high stakes. It's expensive to ship a prototype, but we'll use it later, hopefully, you know, as one of the units. But that's the solution there, because, you know, the city, local, they're willing to do it and even interested, but they're not going to fly somewhere.
Mark, I had a question. Was Hope and Alvarado privately funded or public and private?
Well, but both. It changed. I mean, it was sort of you know, the concept, and I don't think the developer would even mind me saying this. The concept originally was, we want to skip the public funding part and to do it faster, right? And skip some of those hoops and be free of some of those requirements. But as it turned out, you know, some public money, and actually I'm speaking of the next couple of projects that are under construction now, those really do have public money in them, but this has a master agreement with the county, right? So that the county, I don't know the details, but basically the county is, this particular building literally came from a program in the county that and I can't remember the name of it, but you know, remember, I'm a designer, I'm not a financial guy, but here's my designer's version of understanding this, which is basically the county had a program where they basically approach slumlords and say, hey, we'll renovate your unit and then we'll give you a tenant, a supportive housing tenant, and we'll pay the rent, you know, if they don't pay it, right? And that's not that great of a model for a community of unhoused people that need support, because then it's like they're jammed in some building somewhere and their services are somewhere else. So really, I think it's generally migrated best practice to these permanent supportive buildings because it's a community, you know, the support services are there, the counselors come in, and you're living with peers, right? And which is always good. So my understanding is the county is basically subsidizing the tenant's rent, but the tenant signs a lease, but the county backstops it, right? Almost everybody has some income in the form of a disability at least or something, but you know, if they don't pay it, the county does. That's my layman's understanding. So that's public money. Yeah.
Any other questions for Mark right now, or should we have Daniel present and we can?
Hand off?
Oh,
looks like there's,
yeah,
one
here's a
more
good question.
from Robert.
Equality in steel versus wood. So yes, basically both of them, I mean, you can choose, right? But both of them typically come with pre-finished interiors. That's the goal, because the whole point of this is to get as much offsite built as possible. And it's generally, but it is true that steel has typically better tolerances, right? The steel, there's two main advantages of steel, and again, we do both. That they're good in different applications, but the steel is better tolerance and quality control in general, and because less movement, you know, because it doesn't respond as much to temperature and, you know, so forth. The other issue is that wood needs to be protected during construction. If you remember that first, the Casa Paloma that we've got under construction, right? And it's not that giant of an issue in Southern California because we don't have a lot of rain, but this really can't sit here for very long because it's not watertight. You know, I mean, it's you can see it's shipped with it's how can I say, it's watertight. It's watertight for shipping, but not watertight as in my building is watertight, right? And so it's more vulnerable during construction. Again, I don't think that's a aspect in Southern California that matters a whole lot, but in some climates it can be a big deal, right? There's some famous wood modular projects that got caught with a really bad series of storms, and yeah, it suffered some, you know, just what do you call it, destructive testing and rebuilding from the inside out, which is a total you know, very unfortunate. Steel is better at that, but it's just different. You can go taller with steel, but and it really also the cost is kind of similar, but the process is different. So that's a sort of answer and non-answer. And you asked what were the issues of quality with the Chinese modules. There wasn't a quality issue. I mean, it was really the ability to inspect them that was the problem, right? And it's really the changing, and that's something, I mean, that's something if you're sourcing, let me put it this way, you have risks in every project, but the risks are different. You know, the risk in China was we didn't realize there was going to be a tariff risk, but that was a big risk. I mean, not the designer's risk, but the project team, the development risk. They had to absorb the tariffs, right? But the biggest risk was like, oh, you can't fly anymore. Who anticipated that? So some of the inspectors that needed to be there couldn't be. Some of the quality control engineers that split their time between LA and Shanghai couldn't leave Shanghai. So it was a problem, a significant problem, and the disruption in shipping. It wasn't really a quality. I mean, because I did go to the factory and it was like a spaceship practically. It was really incredible, robotic welding and very, you know, because that like it or not, that country and government have significant public investment in private companies. So there's a lot of infrastructure there. Okay.
There are a few other questions that came in as well.
Approach for floor assembly. Yeah, there's right. In each of these, in each, both steel or wood, you still have, it's a six-sided box, so to speak. So you have a ceiling, a floor, another ceiling, another floor. You know, it really is a box. So you end up with two ceilings and two floors, or I mean, a floor and a ceiling coming together. So it does mean, so you typically don't use gypcrete, because but you do use, I mean, you have to get that rating somehow. And that's where it comes into a little bit of the manufacturer's preferred method of getting that assembly. So I mean, this is type 5. This is a very typical assembly, right? It's just like any other wood assembly. It's just there's the structure is different, or there's two layers of structure, right? So but it's not real feasible to pour gypcrete and then move these things. So typically it has a most typically has a cement board finish on the floor, you know, below the finish, or a subfloor that gets that rating. But those are more typical ratings. On the steel, it does depend a lot more on the construction of the modules and the manufacturer's approach to it. And that's where you end up getting, the more custom you are, the more you're going to be talking to, well, not you, but the manufacturer will be utilizing like a third-party testing company like Hilti or something like that to run the tests on them. If that answers your question. Cost differences, yeah, I would say the cost differences per square foot. And I think if you pick up the phone and talk to almost any modular company, they'll tell you, you know, the base per square foot price is $150 to $185. So that's per square foot of module, right? One square foot of that costs, I think this was 160 or 150. I can't remember, but that's the range. And, you know, pump up the interior finishes, increase it, reduce the volume, increase the cost too, right? And that's why, you know, if you have like a 20 unit project, it's really not going to be modular. It's hard to make that work, except for what I would say is almost like a solution like a crate modular. They do a great job because they're basically retrofitting existing shipping containers. Although maybe I think they're also segueing to purpose-built steel. Anyway, it's harder to find a manufacturer to do a small project, and it's because of that, right? Repetition reduces the cost, volume, yeah.
Maybe shift to Daniel's presentation. I know there are a few other questions, so we'll keep track of those and then maybe circle back to them after Daniel.
Awesome. Yep.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to put up my screen here. 1 second. can everyone see the presentation up? All right. So just a little bit about myself, the firm. I work for GGA Plus Architecture. We do a lot of affordable housing, also market rate. We've worked with a big group of Southern California developers, and you know, we do a whole scope of projects. I'm going to primarily be talking a little bit more about, of course, just housing on the affordable side, and more projects from one developer I've worked closely with. I maybe have a little less experience than Mark, being a little younger. So a few less projects finished, but kind of my experience both focused on the regulatory side of the affordable housing, and then kind of some of my experiences. So this is our whole office. You know, we're pretty diverse, and I show everyone because I'm showing a lot of the work that they're responsible for and kind of lessons learned from them. So, you know, it's a team effort here, and just want them to get the credit they deserve as well. So, and these are kind of just what we focus on: housing, civic, educational. I'm on the housing side, of course, but we do all these kind of scopes of service. So, and I'm doing the slide that Mark was saying, every presentation starts with this, but I'm going to talk about it. So, of course, we are in a housing crisis, and just a little bit of background, I think, is always warranted to say where we're at, why we're here. And some of this information, I think, is informative. This is from, you know, reports that are a little bit older, but you can kind of see the trends of development at the top left. This is basically units delivered from 1950 to 2016. And you can kind of really see the peaks and valleys of a recession here. And then we've never really recovered since the 2004 crash. And that deficit is really one thing that we've been working against to try and recover and build more housing. Also kind of interesting to note that, you know, it's really a split now between multifamily and single family, but still both levels are historically quite low. You know, they're saying about, we are doing about 80,000 annually. We need to do more than double. Also, ownership is decreasing, renting is increasing, which is kind of shifting the rental dynamics. We have kind of lower historic zoning density, which impacts some of that. That's kind of a regulatory issue that we're increasingly seeing either changes to or talk about it. There's also tend to be higher soft and hard costs in Southern California. That's kind of a development issue in Southern California and coastal California more specifically. So, you know, I think the state and the local municipality is really becoming more serious about this because they're facing the possible losses economically, as there's a lack of housing for, you know, people, for workers, as well as, you know, forcing people into homelessness. Okay, and then also just I wanted to share this slide diagram down here. Los Angeles really does, it's really the major metros that need to build the most housing. As you get more inland, they're actually meeting their goals a lot better. And we are farther from our goals as you're in the major coastal metropolitans. So, okay, a little bit more, just basically here, this chart kind of tells you where the income distribution is. So what it's telling us is really the squeeze on rental households is primarily in the low to extremely low income, while there's been more development in the moderate to above moderate properties. You know, we all kind of know this as architects. Most of what gets built by private funds is, you know, from private money, and there's a limited supply of public funds to build for kind of low to extremely low income individuals. And then just also another factor to consider, and these are, you know, if you guys want to look at the presentation, there's some great reports that go into all these statistics, but the transportational cost burden is related to the basically locality. As you get farther away from the major cities, the transportation costs kind of shift. So for example, you know, you might think that the cost burdens are highest in San Francisco, but when you factor in transportation with housing, they're actually not as different as some of the outside counties. So that's really why, in a way, we need to be building housing in the metropolitan areas, despite the cheaper cost outside of it. You have to kind of factor in the transportation burden that it weighs on people as well. So just a quick list of some of the legislative actions and municipal legislative actions that people have started to enact to kind of combat this. We all know about the ADU bills, the SB 35, which is our density bonus law, which is kind of allowing affordable housing to get taller and denser. We now have SB 9 and 10 and some pending legislation. I do think it's interesting that SB 9 is passed, and it's kind of the first challenge to local zoning laws. So it kind of signals that the California legislature is starting to look at zoning, at actually intervening in it. Okay, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So again, you know, we have a housing crisis and we also have a homelessness crisis. Our office focuses a lot on homelessness and how to get in that house and housing homeless people. So just to put it in perspective, there's a lot of information here, but California has the most homeless individuals, but we also have by far the most unhoused homeless individuals. That is even worse in Los Angeles County, where we have about a third of California's homeless individuals. So really, we're in LA at a focus of the crisis, and that's why we see a lot of both publicity, unfortunately, and also a lot of funding and development to address it. And again, just kind of saying where we are, we're really leading with the highest rates in both individuals, veterans, and youth, though youth is primarily more of a Northern California problem, more so than Southern. Okay, so what does our office do? How do we involve with this? So we kind of do a whole range of affordable housing, permanent supportive housing. We do transitional housing, a lot of the service centers that were kind of emergency measures from the city. Our office is done as a part of a bridge home. We also are involved with the Project Room Key and Project Home Key with the county. And so those are kind of temporary measures, but then ultimately we really try and build, which these are some projects I'm going to talk about, permanent supportive housing and permanent housing, which is where most of the regulatory, issues that I'm going to talk about are. So this is kind of just one example I want to show, which is one project that two great staff people at our office, Caesar and Mariana, worked on, called the Willows. And it really kind of addressed and did a good job of this bridge housing model. So there's a lot of, this is basically where service providers start. This is where a homeless person would come to provide services from LA Family Housing is the developer in this case. This is just kind of a quick floor plan of how this facility works. There's a sleeping area, lounge, dining, recreation, pet areas, places for couples. But basically this is where you go to kind of intake, get off the street, and then get moved into permanent supportive housing or services. So these were just kind of some of the thoughts that go into making this a place where people will actually want to go. It has a lot to do with privacy, opportunities for choice, safe space, personal dignity. And, Mariana and Caesar really put a lot of thought into how to make this a space that people will want to come off the street and into. And there was a lot of regulatory burden and also rush to complete this project because, the mayor's office really, they needed these facilities open in order to basically, in reaction to court order, and then to allow them to get people off the street or tell them there's somewhere to go. There was an injunction placed basically by a judge, and long story short, if there was no facility in operation where people could be told to go to, the police, no one should be able to tell them to get off the street. So, and these were just some great diagrams that Caesar did that really kind of got into the space of how each of these should work. And I thought they were just kind of really a great way to think about how to make these spaces personal. Okay, so just quickly talk about, this is kind of the biggest example of a project we've completed. Ali Barar, who's the principal at our office, he led this project and knows more about it, but I wanted to show it because it's really an example of all of these services and permanent supportive housing coming together. And this was probably I think the best model and kind of informed the design of the project that I'm going to speak about that I've worked on. But really it's LA Family Housing's campus, and it's up in the northwest area of Los Angeles. it's basically taking their offices, their service center, a clinic, everything they do day to day and putting it into one. And it's the first kind of, it's the only model I've seen like it. And I think it's really one that we hope to see replicated despite the challenges to bring all of this together and the opposition and the complexity you have to go through to build something like this. So this is kind of just the campus layout. Again, the permanent supported housing component, temporary housing, intake, recreational facilities, the LA Family Houses Services Center, their corporate offices. It just really, was a massive project. It's about the size of a city block. And it was really a great success, and the model that we took for our permanent supportive housing that we later did. Just kind of some photos of the different areas and how it turned out. So this is Summit View. This was for many mansions in LA Family Housing. This is the project that I've been working on as project captain for the last 3 years about. I've been involved from schematic design all the way through to we're about 90% completion. It's veterans permanent supportive housing. It's 49 units. It's traditional, it's type 5B over concrete. There's a lot of complications with the project and site, and I'm going to kind of try and talk through a little bit of some of my experiences about it and using it as a case study. So just first, the design of the site, how it started. It was LA City land that was previously entitled and never built on. The reason it was never built on is because it's very aggressive topography. There's about a 50-foot grade change from the street to the top of it. So it had both entitlement conditions, queue conditions, a lot of complicated entitlement associated with it. It also had to go through environmental EIR and a whole series of that, which I wasn't involved with, but had to make its way through permitting. So a little bit of, this is the site. This is Sylmar, which is LA City, but kind of the northern part of it. It's right next to Hanson Dam. This is the 210 freeway here. Really trying to take some influence though of the beauty of the site and roll that into the design of the project and incorporate the nature really as a rehabilitation space. Just a little bit of how we looked at it, who it serves. These would be the residents, homeless veterans, kind of looking at how they use the site. Caseworkers, so this is who day to day they interact with, and basically who helps them throughout navigating, whether it's their income stream, what they're dealing with, everything basically. So they have to, there's a programmatic design I'm on really around the caseworkers day and the occupants day. And then, just friends and visitors and people coming to the site to see people. So this is kind of the site you can see here. That's each one of those lines is 5 feet. So we've got a 50-foot grade change to kind of navigate. The land, by the way, was City of LA was donated, so it was free to the developer. So that's one of the reasons that they took on the site and they decided to try and use it, even though it had been undevelopable or people. It was a challenge to develop, let me say, at the least. So this is kind of our massing and how the conceptualization of the site should work to kind of try and split the mass and then locate it around this central plaza. There's also a lot of complicated geology in the site. It's all granite, and kind of trying to split the mass and locate it around this central edge of rock was an attempt to try and reduce the amount of excavation and parking and podium that we would need to build. Other constraints around it, obviously, were getting access, fire, and the street improvements that would be required to put a building up here. There's only one foothill is down here, about 50 feet below. And then there's only a partially improved portion of the street here on the rear. So a lot of kind of site concerns on this project that kind of fed into additional regulatory issues. So this is it today. This is about 90% complete. You can kind of see those are the 4 massings kind of set on the plaza. That was all rock that was ground down. That's the top of the hillside here. This is Kegel, which is going to be improved, and this is Foothill. The dam here is to the south. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the regulatory issues that are encountered. That's kind of, I think, what we're here to primarily talk about. So the first kind of thing I want to say is, you know, as architects, we operate in the latter phases of the construction pipeline, right? There's government regulatory space, which would be, you know, zoning, planning, entitlement, everything that is set up and then basically passed to us where we take it off. So in a public housing project, there are some different concerns than a traditional privately funded project, but anyway, at the end, if there are delays along the way, we're usually facing them. They stack up as the project goes on. And like Mark was saying, on these kind of jobs, time can be a real concern and even can even really break the job if you're not meeting deadlines that are funding based. So, you know, there's always a concern, especially with public projects, that as time goes throughout each phase, you have to account for any kind of slip in time as you go an extra amount. So I just kind of wanted to point out that that's really where we interface. The government really interfaces up here, and any kind of regulatory, there's a lot of work they're doing in the regulatory space there. Ours is more in the latter phases. Okay, so just a little bit about cost. I know Mark talked about this, but everyone wants to talk about costs and affordable housing. So just a few trends that influence cost and where we're at. We talked a little bit about it before. Typically the coastal areas, Los Angeles, any of the major metro areas are higher cost. The reasons for that are complex. On this job, I'll break down where our funding sources are and what kind of issues they're imposed by them. But, you know, largely, as Mark kind of said, there is more of a concern for material and investment upfront versus deferred maintenance. You know, most of the developers, they only have a certain amount of budget, and they want to make sure that they don't have deferred costs once the project is completed. So things like, you know, there may be requirements for plywood casework throughout, or for example, a certain square footage of unit, or ceiling fans, or garbage disposals, or you know, there's just a whole slew of different requirements that can be either imposed by funding or by ownership, because they won't have money to replace the roof in 10 years, right? It's very typical to have like a 30-year warranty on your roof, which may not be typical on a either non-public job. So there are kind of different quality costs that are associated. There are different land costs that can be associated depending on where you're building. Los Angeles being, of course, more expensive. And then also the size of development does have correlation to the cost per unit. You know, this job is that magic number 49. That's because it was done to avoid site plan review at the city specifically, which is one concern for developers. Jobs are we're seeing them grow now, so they're getting a little bit bigger. And as you get a larger development, the costs kind of get split better between the units. Parking requirements and construction type also heavily correlate with cost issues. So podium, above 4 stories, anything like that. The data says that there's some correlation to higher cost per unit as well. And then, of course, which Mark mentioned, labor and wages. There's not a lot of studies that say it, but it's always a concern for each project. And there is definitely, from my observation, a difference in cost for prevailing or even local hire provisions can impact the cost of a project. So you can kind of see right here on the right, that's 2020, that's the current data. The per unit cost from TCAC, you know, we're right here at, you know, in the $300,000 to $522,000 per unit range. And that's just delivered cost. So this is just about the project specifically. This is where our funding sources came from, our buckets of money that the developer shared. So we were one of the first Triple H projects in Los Angeles. So that was the basically one of the major initiatives in 2016, $1.2 billion, I believe. That was on measure to provide permanent supportive housing and throughout LA City. So ours was one of the first projects to receive that funding. Haven't been too many coming online. I think typically we're gonna start seeing a bunch of them delivered this year. But there's an injunction and a lot of issues going on with Triple H, but that's one of the buckets of money we are using. Of course, we have our LACDA, that's the other two large areas. So these kind of impose restrictions on what community the building would serve. Design review, some of the requirements that I was talking about, I don't want to go too much into them, but it's things like materials, finishes, size of units, some of the countertops, the casework. There's just certain requirements that have to be followed. And there's also a scoring checklist that the developer kind of picks. So depending on the scoring point system, it can kind of guide how the project is designed and how much work we as architects have to do along the way. Another thing that can be triggered here is universal design, which is another cost issue if that's something the project is trying to do. There's just a different list of design criteria if the project goes that way. But I know that's they're trying to deliver more fully accessible housing units, and especially if you're doing something like senior living, that's one where you might do universal design. Also, local hire requirements come with this, and additional contractor requirements. So same for LACDA, that's just a different bucket from them. There's a Home Depot grant, which is largely community serve and publicity. And then City of Los Angeles Community Development Block Grant. So that was specific to this project because we had extensive offsite improvements that were required. Again, part of the entitlement and the agreement for the project required very extensive offsite improvements. I mean, on this, we're currently looking at about $3 million of just offsite improvement. So the developer had to reach out and get money basically money from the city to cover a portion of that to make it feasible. And then, I'm sorry, there was one here that also imposed not just local hire, but prevailing wage. Yeah, that's from the Triple H. And then just low income housing tax credits. So not to go over too much the finance funding, but I think it's important to kind of look at it. And this is kind of our list that made this project possible. And kind of some of the requirements that go along with it. Again, this is just kind of a sample mix. I don't know if it really correlates to ours. I think ours is skewed a little bit more local because of Triple H and some other measures, but this is kind of just a sample mix of what they give you. Currently, this is the allocation of the Triple H funds. So that big part of the pie is for permanent supportive housing. So just one note for architects, for us, what does all this mean for us? The more funding sources, the more applications, the more requirements, the more time it takes, and possibly the more deadlines you might have to meet. So as this list grows, it just really increases the amount of work we have to do throughout the design and construction phase to make sure we're meeting all of these requirements. And they don't always match up. Some things may require one thing and another one doesn't want it. So sometimes you have to kind of navigate the differences. Okay, so during a crisis, one of our constraints is always time, right? Triple H, the money went out in 2016, and they're hoping to have units online as soon as they can get them, right? Typically, what we are seeing for a development around here, it's a 4 to 5 year development timeline. I think Mark was talking about time. We're always trying to squeeze this down, and I think, some of the strategies he's talking about is one great way, but for this one, it panned out to be just 4 or 5 years, just like they kind of have been. So I kind of just, wanted to kind of put up the highs and lows of some of the stuff you have to go through and some of the differences for public funded housing. So again, sometimes pre-development NIMBYism can be an issue. Entitlement or complex zoning can be an issue. CEQA review is one that gets a lot of headlines, but increasingly they're trying to, it's not as big of an issue in my mind for smaller projects. As things grow, it becomes a much bigger issue. But it does impose conditions that later we all have to design around or figure out. Geotechnical investigation and eventually your conditions of approval, although something that's going to get passed through and can be very specific or different for public housing depending on community outreach and the feelings around the project. So then just design and permitting, again, just more design requirements for accessibility, funding, verification, plan check requirements. This one, as I think was the first one to go through at the time HCID, now the housing department. Now they actually do plan check review and they go through the whole way of construction for their final sign off. Just product selection warranty. Then in construction, just some of the big items again is local hire, prevailing wage, some of the bidding issues. In this project, I think one of the major issues that doesn't get talked about enough is there are specific times to pull your permit and basically when you have to have a contract signed for funding. And that can really constrain you in terms of bidding because only certain contractors do this kind of work. And if you are in a crunch to hire a contractor, you don't have a lot of flexibility in bidding. You really end up having to select one and sign an agreement just due to your time constraints of maybe losing your credits, which I think is actually a serious issue that I don't know an answer to it, but it's one that you end up getting pushed into because permitting takes a long time and you don't want to bid it before it's approved. And then you end up having to kind of settle for the numbers you're given. So just one kind of note there. In construction, we all know the kind of issues with this site in particular. It was a lot of geographical and grading issues, but I think that's not really particular to public housing. But there is a lot of verification stuff, like Mark was saying, ADA and CASP, and really that is there's a lot more you have to check than a market rate. And then eventually close out and occupancy, which is what we're working to here. Again, we have a lot of utility coordination on this one. We have, a whole series of power lines and DWP pole spotters and all sorts of utility stuff that has to happen that takes a really, really long time. I think our B permit and our offsites were just approved about 2 months ago and we're at 80% completion. So the offsite stuff, we always try and have it done early, but from my experience, it really just it goes even into the end of construction and it starts holding up all your utilities and everything you need to really close out buildings. So that's really another kind of issue that I know the city and we've always been trying to work on how to improve it. And then the last one, which Mark touched on too, but is this the NAC review, which is a big concern now. I know all the projects they're now having it done after TCO. Even some projects that have been completed for a year are having a NAC review done. And just as an example, these reports can be about 500 pages, and it can be something as simple as the faucet handle to a garbage disposal or even, slope compliance issues. And so this project, we're going to have, we have a lot of concerns. As you can see, it's a big, long, accessible roadway and a lot of open space with paving. So controlling your slope to within 1 to 2% everywhere is a challenge. So, and that's what we're being asked to do. So I think that's primarily it for this. This project's been a big challenge for me and a big learning experience. But it's going to be a fantastic place for some homeless veterans when it's done. For me.
Terrific work. I suppose we could probably open it up for questions for both Daniel and Mark, and even if they have questions for each other to kick it off. But so many different topics there. I suppose that the general one that comes across my mind is of the numerous headaches and regulations that are these projects are subject to? Are there ones that you see could somehow be altered for the better or should?
Well, this is an AIA presentation here, and as you were talking, Daniel, I was reflecting on how there doesn't seem to be a correlation, at least in my fees and the complexity of the shifting regulatory environment. I haven't, and soft costs are high, but I don't think architectural soft costs are high enough. That would be my comment. And half in jest and kind of not. I don't know what you're seeing, Daniel.
I don't do all the contract stuff, but I'm familiar with it. I think our soft costs are in line with the development costs of these projects typically, which are higher, right? Which kind of makes up for it, but it's definitely more time. Yeah, it is more time to do these projects.
And unpredictable
and,
in some,
and
I'd
unpredictable.
say. Yeah. I mean, this is this is really a wonderful project that you showed us. And I think that, the land is free, but it definitely came with some complexity, right? I mean, it
Yeah.
increased the cost at the time. And I was thinking about that B permit you're talking about. It's significant, very significant.
Yeah, and again, that's it is an ask from the city, and they're paying for it partially, but there are things that we're struggling. One example, and that we have to do a huge retaining wall across that this 50-foot cut, right, to expand the street. That's a couple million, $1 million something dollars, and we're over budget on it. So we're trying to work with BOE to soil nail it instead. That's something that that BOE just generally says we don't do it, right? So there's things like that are hard, or maybe in the city of LA, where sometimes we're hoping they're going to work with us to try and get things in budget and try and work with us with some other solutions from engineering. I think DWP actually has been very responsive, and they're accelerating their work on the poles for us. So they've helped us out a lot. But yeah, it's a big cost, and there's kind of a different approach for, I don't want to say fighting it, but it's the money is coming from the public in a way, but it's cost out of development too, and it's hard to find sometimes. So you're right, the site came with significant cost to develop outside of just building the units. I mean, building a fire access lane and roadway and other things are the site selection is just because the land is free doesn't mean it's going to be any cheaper to build on, right?
One thing that I really liked about your presentation, Daniel, was that you're showing people. You're showing the users, the caseworkers, and it does. It's a good reminder that this. Just the building is just the beginning, right? There's significant support staff and nonprofit and quasi nonprofit and for-profit. Not agencies, but I guess collaborators that really have to pull this off, because it's not just a building permanent supportive anyway, right? It's a community of support, and the support is significant.
Exactly, and they, there's staff that works there. And by the way, the operators and owners, they are nonprofit developers, but they do get a profit fee on development, right? But without that fee basically goes into future acquisitions and future development. So, when they say there's profit in it, it's not like it's there, they're making a lot of money. It's really a way for them to keep developing, or else they would build once and then they'd be done. But yeah, there's a community, and the building functions really in a supportive role to help people survive and thrive while they're there. It's not just a key and then they're left there. And it's a great model. And again, my boss, Ollie, who's kind of did the campus and kind of introduced me into this work. He's really done a lot of work with LA Family Housing and many mansions to kind of make this model work. And that really drove a lot of the design of the project. That's why we have this kind of central courtyard. There's case managers ringed around it. And it's really supposed to be a great outside space using this kind of amazing site because, you know, there's not a lot of luxury stuff in here. It's really just trying to make something great through the space we have. So I'm glad you picked up on some of that, Mark.
So to Robert Gross, yeah, I know about the competition. You know, architects, it's like, golly, we're our own worst enemies in terms of fees and competition. And I think it's hard to quantify maybe time-wise the commitment for public versus private, because some private projects, you know, I mean, I worked on a private project in Los Feliz that took 4 years to entitle. There was really no way to predict the cost of entitlement. You know, it just was, you know, I think from the developer's perspective, absurdly high fees, but because you just never know. I think what you definitely have though with public projects is a definite, I mean, you can tell from the detail that Daniel presented, there's a whole layer of experience and knowledge that you need in terms of understanding what you need to kind of be aware of, right? And that's a whole other level. So I would say it probably is a lot harder to, it takes more time to get that experience. But it's real hard to compare apples to apples, I think.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, Mark, you know, the community involvement and kind of what you need to do where you're located can have a big impact, right? You know, this is in Silmar, it's somewhat removed from residential neighborhoods. You know, other projects we've done can have a lot more, you know, negative feelings from or NIMBYism around, right? And that can kind of drag out entitlement phase. It can stop it at a few places. You know, it can even be, if it becomes political, even kind of be a problem later. I tend to find timelines, I think I have one project that's it's affordable, but it's privately funded going on. And I have this one. The timelines are similar just because, again, I think they're constrained. You know, if there was no funding constraints, they would probably drag on a lot longer. So in a way, I think the funding constraints are a double-edged sword. They're good and bad, but I don't think I think the entitlement can be longer, but the construction and design is similar from my experience.
Yeah, and I'm reading what I'm looking off is reading your question, Corey. Yeah, he would have the right response. I think the difficulty is, you know, and is that it is significant, and it's not a single, you know, like problem, right? It's a sort of a larger environmental problem, and I don't mean in the sense of the natural environment. I mean just the regulatory, the litigation, the layers of requirements, and to some extent the complexity of the program. Yeah, but I know that I will say that you know, I think that at the state level, a lot of the, you know, the last two legislation that's been passed in the last 2 years has been basically a result of I guess maybe constituent or a common frustration with how long things take to entitle. So that's short-circuiting. You know, that's short-circuiting significant delays, and I think we'll see the impact of that yielding more housing faster. But each project takes 3 or 4 years, so it's a little bit of, it's a, you know, it's like, in 3 or 4 years you'll start to see the effects of that, right? But I do think that the local changes in LA, the TOC and some of the CPIOs have simplified at least the front end regulatory environment. And I think the state bills are making feasibility much more and giving more, I guess, surety, not insurance, but surety to projects being able to be completed. And really what I'm talking around is without having to do an EIR, right, to add 2 years to a project. So, and that's maybe one of the most significant pieces of legislation that has come out last couple of years. I will say, tagging on to that, I will say, a lot of architects have, us and also a lot of architects, I'm sure, have clients who are interested in so-called or literal workforce housing, like 120% of AMI, either statutory or just, new projects aimed at that market level, because it's clearly an area you saw right on your affordability graphs, Daniel. It's like, yeah, that's where the crisis is, right? I mean, that's why, those unhoused people,
They're getting jammed down. Yeah,
they didn't just show up. Yeah, they become unhoused, and from that squeeze you're talking about. So that's very interesting to me, and that is maybe another level of challenge in a market environment.
Yeah,
but that level of interest is super encouraging.
Mark, and too, I know just from the other project I was referencing, it's privately funded nonprofit. So they have not market rate. They have market rate, workforce, and then low, and it's a mix of income scales. And how they accomplished a lot of that was through inclusionary housing transfer funds that allowed them to kind of pay for some of the development upfront or acquire land. And I think that was actually, you're seeing more of that. I know LA has inclusionary housing, Pasadena here does. I think some of that is helping to feed into making that development space a little more. So yeah, I think there's when these kind of income levels get mixed, I think it benefits a project. I hope to see more of that as well.
So just as a side note, if you're seeing my lights go on and off, you're seeing the sort of effects of, improvements, right? We've got motion sensors on our lights. This is our new office, so it's state of the art. But once everyone's left, the lights go off if I sit too still. So I've got to mute myself, clap them back on because it's sound activated, and then they come back on. So that's a perfect example. It's way more sustainable, more complex, more costly, and right now embarrassing.
I think that might be the way to wrap it up then, Mark, if you just
the lights will just go off.
Yeah, the lights will just go off, exit stage left.
Yeah, right.
That was terrific. Thank you both for sharing both of those projects, and it was unintentionally ended with the veterans housing project on today, Veterans Day. So I thought that was
Perfect
quite apropos.
timing. Yeah.